Okay, let's dive in. What if getting really good at the piano wasn't just about endless hours?
Right, like maybe there's a smarter way, a shorter path.
Exactly. And today we're cracking open a book that basically claims just that. It's called Piano Technique, and it pulls together ideas from the pianist Walter Gieseking and his teacher, Karl Leimer.
Yeah, and this particular edition, the Dover one from 72, it actually combines two older books from way back in the 1930s
Uh-huh.
and one of those original titles. Get this, The Shortest Way to Pianistic Perfection.
Wow. Okay, yeah, they weren't messing around.
Not at all. Pretty bold.
So for this first look, our plan is really just to understand the groundwork. We're looking at the very beginning, Gieseking's own foreword, and an introduction by someone called James Francis Cook.
Mm-hmm.
We want to get a feel for, why Gieseking thought this method was so special and why digging into it might be useful for you listening, whether you play, teach, or just interested in, well, mastery.
And Gieseking, I mean, this guy was a giant, right? A
Yeah.
top-tier concert pianist. And he flat out called the Leimer method the best and most rational way he knew to reach the top level.
When someone like him says that,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of have to lean in, don't you?
You really do. So what was it? What did he see in it?
That's the question.
Welcome to Piano Night Studio, a podcast where music, piano, and literature come together. Here, we explore the stories behind the notes, the lives of composers and performers, and the books that have shaped the musical world. Whether you're a pianist, a passionate listener, or simply someone who finds beauty in the sound of a single note, this space is for you. In each episode, we go through ideas, emotions, and the timeless connection between music and words. Thank you for joining us.
Well, Gieseking highlights two main things Leimer focused on. First, teaching self-control. But maybe even more important, teaching the student how to actually hear themselves, critically.
Okay.
He actually says, and this is a quote, "Critical self-hearing is, in my opinion, by far the most important factor in all of music study."
By far the most important. Wow. That's huge.
He even says playing for hours without really concentrating your thoughts and your ear on every single note, just wasted time.
Wasted time. Ouch. Okay.
Yeah, the goal is training your ear to be super sensitive, to catch those tiny little inaccuracies, the unevenness that stops a piece from being truly great.
And he says this constant listening, it doesn't just fix notes, it improves tone quality too.
Yeah.
And dynamics.
That's right. It refines everything. And this self-control, this ear, it seems vital for something else. He really hammers home rhythm.
Yes, rhythm.
Yeah. He insists really accurately rhythmical playing can be achieved only through severe self-control.
Severe self-control.
He found sloppy rhythm just, unbearable to a trained ear, and apparently it was a common problem even back then.
And he links this precision directly to interpretation, doesn't he? Saying Leimer's training gave him his unconditional respect for what the composer actually wrote.
Precisely. He argued that playing exactly what's on the page, every note, every marking, is the essential first step. Only then can you truly understand and perform the piece as intended.
No retouching or taking liberties, as he put it.
Right. He saw that as just falsifying the work. Real faithfulness needs that total control, guided by that critical ear.
What I find fascinating is how he describes the end result. Like, you hear the music perfectly in your head first.
And the Leimer system aims to get you there fast by being incredibly efficient.
How so?
By cutting out all unnecessary movements, using only the muscles you need just when you need them, and staying relaxed. Gieseking really felt that efficiency was why it was the quickest path.
The quickest to this goal, as he said. He believed in it so much he pushed Leimer to publish it.
Yeah. Now, the introduction by James Francis Cook adds another viewpoint. He kind of acknowledges, okay, the shortest way, maybe a bit strong, there's no single silver bullet.
Right, a dose of realism there.
But even Cook, having seen tons of methods, basically says, after reading this, it's hard to imagine a course that's more direct, more sound, and yet more constructive.
High praise.
And he puts it down to that elimination of the unnecessary, and also that unique blend. The teacher's theory, Leimer's, combined with the practical experience of his star pupil, Gieseking.
Foundations of my method.
Specifically, that section on training of the musical ear?
Yes. The author starts laying out the basics of their system here. And they claim it gets, frankly, pretty exceptional results with students.
Results that are really different from what you normally see in piano playing.
Exactly. They're suggesting this isn't just, other method.
They make a big claim, actually, that it might be the shortest, maybe even the only way to fully develop musical talent and expressive power.
So our job today is to unpack these foundational ideas they start with. What's at the core of this system?
Okay, so first thing, they're very clear. This isn't really for absolute beginners.
Right. It's aimed at, let's say, experienced players, teachers, maybe advanced amateurs, people who already have some foundation.
It builds on what's already there.
Mm-hmm. And while the ideas are based on observing what works naturally, the author thinks their specific arrangement into a system is what makes it, potentially revolutionary.
So what's the starting point? The absolute main thing?
The author immediately points to the training of the ear. That's identified as the chief point, the most crucial basis.
And what's interesting is how they define that.
Yeah, it's not just about hearing if you played a wrong note. They observe that most pianists, even good ones, don't really truly hear themselves accurately.
They notice the pitch, maybe catch a mistake, but that's kind of it.
Pretty much. But the author argues something else is actually more important, especially for modern playing.
Which is?
Noticing the exact tone quality, the exact tone duration, and the exact tone strength.
So the character of the sound, not just whether it's the right note.
Precisely. The color, how long it rings, the subtle volume of each individual note.
That's a massive shift in focus.
It really is. And they say that paying such close attention, this minute observation, brings immense clarity to the playing.
And a definite character.
Right.
So.
And allows for really subtle expression. You don't need huge dynamic swings or exaggerated rhythms to make the music speak.
It sounds more refined, less forced.
But it's not easy. This kind of listening doesn't just happen.
Needs training.
Systematic training, yeah.
Yeah.
And intense concentration. The author mentions, actually, that Gieseking himself said listening to oneself is one of the most vital parts of studying music.
So it takes time and effort.
Definitely. But this detailed listening, this polishing up of sounds in small sections, they argue actually keeps studying interesting.
Because you find the piece's true character.
Exactly. And you achieve this surprising level of perfection bit by bit.
Okay, so intense ear training is foundational. What else is indispensable right at the start?
The second pillar is gaining accurate knowledge of the piece through visualization.
Visualization, like mentally rehearsing.
Yeah.
Away from the piano.
Exactly that. The idea is to visualize the piece so thoroughly before you even practice it on the instrument.
The author notes something interesting here, that many really intelligent students find this whole idea completely new.
It is surprising, isn't it, that it's not a more standard technique. Seems almost obvious in hindsight.
Yeah.
And they bring up Gieseking again. Apparently, he built that huge repertoire of his, not just by playing pieces over and over.
But by visualizing them. Silent reading.
That's what the author states, yes. Through silent reading and mental visualization.
Wow. And it goes even further, doesn't it? This visualization can actually prepare the technique.
That's the really striking part. The claim is you can achieve a perfect performance very quickly without physical practice, just through this mental work.
But give an example, right? About a student and a Debussy piece.
Yeah. A pupil apparently saw a Debussy piece, visualized it for maybe 10 or 15 minutes.
And then played it perfectly, expressively, first try.
That's the anecdote, yes. Purely from the visualization.
Incredible. Though they do say you don't need to memorize everything this way.
No, not etudes or things you're just reading through, but performance pieces, exercises, Bach, and crucially, training the brain to memorize short phrases regularly, even for beginners.
Got it. And there was a third element mentioned briefly.
Yes, the third foundation is learning to consciously exert and relax muscles.
Okay, so physical technique, but with a specific focus.
The emphasis is on the internal feeling of relaxation and control. Not just how your hands look, but feeling it from within.
Aiming for the absolute minimum necessary strain.
Exactly. Natural, efficient, strain-free playing based on conscious internal awareness.
the student begins work.
That's right. This is where the real foundational stuff starts. We're looking at sections A through D.
Yeah, focusing on those core concepts, relaxation, touch, practice.
And how they get applied straight away. Not just in, basic exercises, but in real pieces. Bach, Beethoven, it's all connected.
Okay, so our mission here is to really pull out those essential nuggets. What does true relaxation mean at the piano? What are these different touches?
And the practice methods. They're incredibly detailed.
Yeah.
Plus, how understanding the music itself is, well, inseparable from technique.
Right. Let's unpack it. Section A, it kicks off with Leimer and Stark's principles.
And the big one, maybe a bit counterintuitive, is relaxation. The source compares it to how your arm hangs when you walk. Just loose.
Free from tension.
Yeah, exactly. Tension is the enemy, basically. It blocks everything.
And that starts with how you sit, right? Forward on the bench, slight incline.
Yeah, getting the seat height just right, so your lower arm is about level with the keyboard.
And the hand position, not stretched out or clawed up.
No, just a natural curve, like that walking hand again. And crucially, it says avoid pressing through the knuckle joints. That causes stiffness.
Makes sense. It also mentions eliminating unnecessary movement for decisiveness.
Precisely. Repose, they call it. And interestingly, they bring in visualization really early.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, seeing the notes in your mind, the structure,
Yeah.
like ternary form, for example. The idea is this mental map helps you memorize and guide your fingers.
Fascinating. Okay, what about this free fall touch? Sounds dramatic.
It does. But the description is quite practical. You lift the whole arm up and lower together, maybe 2 inches or so, and then just let it drop. Let gravity do the work. You press the key until you sort of feel ground.
Using the arm's weight.
Exactly. Which makes it great for dynamics, from super soft to really loud. And the source argues it's actually more reliable, more accurate than just focusing on wrist action.
Less tension that way too, maybe.
That seems to be the implication. And tied to this right from the start.
Yeah.
Ear training.
Not just hitting the right note.
Not at all. It's about hearing the quality of the tone, the duration. Your brain tells your fingers what to do, sure, but it's the ear that confirms if it was done right.
So the ear guides the correction.
And relaxation is key for those brain signals to even reach the fingers cleanly. It lays out this 4-day practice cycle for an etude.
Oh, walk us through that quickly.
Okay, day 1, play from memory after visualizing it. Day 2, focus purely on the physical stuff, posture, hand position, the lift, the drop, feeling the keys. Tiny sections, perfect repetition.
Right.
Day 3, keep observing the rules, but now really focus on feeling the relaxation. Actively notice and release tension, but maintain necessary slight support, say, in the wrist. Don't let it collapse.
Constant attention.
Constant. Day 4, that's all about rhythmic precision, absolute equality of notes, and using your ear to catch the tiniest mistakes. It takes weeks to master one study this way, but they claim it speeds up overall progress dramatically.
Wow. Okay, depth over breadth. Let's move to section B, a different touch.
Yeah, pressure playing. This is crucial for legato, for that singing tone. Here, the finger doesn't leave the key immediately.
Stays connected.
Stays connected. Allows for really smooth lines and subtle shading. The example piece is Bach's first 2-part invention.
Why that piece?
It structures clear motif, counterpoint, good for focusing just on applying this pressure touch. And the instruction is, practice very slowly.
Always slowly.
Always. To prepare each tone, control every movement, stay relaxed, get the volume even. Again, small parts, repeated perfectly. It also breaks down grace notes, like the mordent.
How should those be played?
First note, bang on the beat. Precise. Practice it relaxed, even separately at first, then integrate it. Getting that timing right is huge for training your rhythmic sense.
Got it. Section C moves to Bach's 3-part invention, number 1.
Yeah.
Still focused on legato.
Legato and rhythmic accuracy, especially with more complex textures. It introduces specific techniques.
Like
The repeated key touch, where you only let the key come up maybe 3/4 of the way before playing it again.
Yeah.
Thumb gliding for smooth connections. And hand relief.
Hand relief.
Yeah, where one hand holds a note just until the other hand takes over the exact same note or continues the line seamlessly, needs perfect timing.
And rhythm is paramount here.
Absolutely critical. The source really hammers this point. Tiny rhythmic flaws completely change the music's character. It suggests measure-by-measure practice to solve specific issues, like tricky fingerings or legato joins. Intense concentration plus faultless execution builds technique fast.
Okay, finally, section D. Applying all this to Beethoven.
Yep, the very first sonata, Opus 2, number 1 in F minor. This is where visualization starts becoming the inner ear, moving from just physical technique to really hearing the music internally.
And applying the touches we discussed.
Exactly. Like light staccato, quick release, no jerkiness. Left-hand chords use that feel ground arm touch for evenness. Interpretation details come in 2 accents, crescendos, bringing out melodies, all built on that technical control.
What about specific challenges, like triplets?
Big focus there. Strict equality of the 3 notes, played precisely on the beat, often rushed or uneven, apparently. Legato octaves 2 best with 1 to 5 fingering, holding the key long, gliding at the last second.
And that rolling motion.
Ah, yes, for the left hand sometimes.
Wow.
Using a whole arm from the shoulder. Gives smoothness, power, helps relaxation. Good for arpeggios, tremolos, controlling dynamics. It even tackles things like playing 3 notes against 4. Hand separate first, count the smallest subdivision, use a metronome. The main point, though, is that really digging deep into one complex piece like this gives you tons of material for technique and interpretation.
So bringing it all together, what's the big picture for the students starting out based on this chapter?
Well, it seems to be about intense focus on fundamentals. Physical principles like relaxation, these different specific touches, combined with really training your ear using visualization.
And that incredibly slow, detailed, almost microscopic practice.
Right. On carefully chosen pieces, it builds this solid, almost surprisingly powerful foundation.
And the surprising takeaway you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, the source really pushes this idea that this deep, focused work on just a few pieces, even seemingly simple ones at first, gets you further faster than just skimming through lots of music. It's that depth, not breadth, that builds real mastery.
Natural interpretation.
Yeah, natural interpretation. It really gets right to the heart of something, doesn't it? This whole question musicians face. How do you be expressive? How do you put yourself into the music, but, without messing up what the composer actually wrote?
Exactly. And you hear this sometimes, maybe you've even felt it yourself if you play, this urge to bend the rhythm, play things a bit unevenly.
Legato, yeah.
Right, rubato, sometimes deliberately for expression, sometimes maybe it's just, inaccurate reading, perhaps. But there's this notion floating around that making things uneven, even when the notes look equal on the page, somehow makes it more interesting, more expressive.
And the author here takes a pretty strong stance on that. They point out that, okay, maybe some audiences go for those kinds of, let's call them distortions. But the really respected musicians, the ones who, really get it, they are incredibly careful about accuracy, like really careful.
So for them, messing with the composer's clear instructions, that's just not the way to genuine interpretation.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The author argues that getting the execution absolutely correct isn't just like a nice to have.
Yeah.
No, it's the essential foundation. It's the only solid ground, they'd say, for building a truly great interpretation.
Okay, wow. That really pushes back against that idea that, you need to break the rules, bend the score to sound truly expressive.
It does. But, and here's the important bit, the author isn't saying composers can write down every single tiny detail. That's impossible, right? The score would be a mess.
Unreadable, yeah.
So this is where the musician comes in. You need knowledge, deep knowledge, and also a kind of felt sense of the aesthetic rules, rhythm, style, form.
Okay, let's unpack that. So accuracy is key, non-negotiable.
Yes.
But within that accuracy, there is space for expression, guided by these sort of unspoken aesthetic rules.
Precisely. The author talks about things like phrasing and also subtle tempo changes. But the key word is proportional.
Proportional? How so?
Well, think of a musical phrase. It often builds to a high point, a climax.
Right.
The author suggests, okay, maybe a slight speed up or getting a bit louder as you approach that peak. And then, correspondingly, maybe easing off a little, slowing down slightly after the peak. That kind of subtle shaping is allowed.
And the argument is if you do that in the right manner, Naturally, proportionally, it doesn't just make the phrase more alive.
Yeah.
It actually boosts the expression. It supposedly mirrors our natural musical feelings. So it's not random tweaking. It's like guided shaping.
Guided shaping purport. Yes, exactly. But the author is very firm. Don't overdo it.
Oh.
Exaggeration is out. A big part of the training, they say, is teaching the student to feel what's musically right, how to adjust tempo and dynamics proportionally. It's about developing taste, sensibility, not just mechanics.
Which leads to something that might feel a bit odd if you think expression is just pure, raw emotion.
What's that?
The author talks about developing a student's powers of feeling, not by ditching structure, but through mastering the technical side.
Yes. This directly counters that, romantic idea that feeling should just wash over everything, ignore the brain.
Right, the head versus the heart thing.
Exactly. The author's clear, convincing interpretation needs both intellect and feeling working together. The brain understands the structure. The feeling guides how you apply it through technique.
So brain plus feeling, not brain versus feeling. And your technique makes it possible.
That's the idea. And they see inaccurate playing, clumsy dynamics, disproportionate tempo changes as actually harming the student's musical taste. If you don't fix those habits early,
They stick.
they stick. And they make the playing sound unnatural, forced.
The book also touches on, well, touch itself, doesn't it? How you physically play the notes.
Absolutely crucial. Using the right kind of touch for the right passage is fundamental to execution. Finding the most sort of accurate, easy, and tasteful way to play often boils down to mastering different touches.
And that needs a good teacher who gets it.
Who gets it and can show it, yeah. And while, top professionals might have slight variations,
Sure.
the author feels there isn't actually a huge range of debatable interpretations among people with a really refined musical sense. They talk about convincing students not just by explaining, but by the sound they achieved.
The results?
Yeah, the warmth, the intensity, the clarity that came when students followed these principles of accuracy and proportion. Showing them, note by note, the right balance apparently brought them around.
Which the author sees as proof of the concept.
It seems so.
Yeah.
The really striking thing here is this idea that deep expression comes not from escaping the rules, but from mastering them, and then applying this refined judgment, this cultivated feeling. It's the combination.
So thinking about this chapter, natural interpretation, what does it mean for you listening? The author's take is pretty clear. It starts with rock-solid accuracy.
Absolutely.
Then you layer on this deep understanding, this felt knowledge of aesthetic rules. It's about bringing intellect and feeling together, not setting them against each other.
All enabled by practice and technique. Making steady count.
So where does the chapter start? What's the foundational point?
It hits you right away with something maybe a little unexpected. It argues the teacher's most crucial job, their biggest duty, really, is teaching the student how to practice properly.
Oh, interesting. Not just teaching the notes or the piece itself.
Nope. It's about the method, guiding the pupil, as it says, untiringly, in the best way to work.
Okay. And does it mention any common pitfalls, things teachers or students often get wrong?
Yeah, it does. A big one is moving on too fast. Jumping to the next piece before the current one is genuinely mastered. Maybe the teacher worries about keeping things interesting. Maybe the student pushes for it.
I can see that happening, that feeling of, okay, I played it through, next.
Right. But here's the kicker. The chapter argues that the biggest progress, both technically and musically, actually happens after most people think a piece is, finished.
Wait, after. So when you feel like you've learned it, that's when the real work starts.
That's the claim. That's supposedly when the most vital work kicks in, training your ear, perfecting all those tiny details. It's in that careful, sort of painstaking polishing that you get the greatest profits, as the book puts it.
That makes a certain kind of sense. The struggle is over, so you can focus on the finesse.
Exactly. And it says that's when musical study becomes truly joyful, too, because you're refining, not just wrestling with notes.
Okay, so how does this practice actually work? What's the mechanism the book describes?
It uses this analogy of a photograph. Repeating the music correctly imprints a picture on your brain.
Like a mental image.
Sort of. At first, it's faint, like an underexposed photo. But constant repetition makes it sharper, clearer, until it's distinct.
Got it. Building that blueprint. But what if you practice with mistakes?
Ah, well, that's the danger zone. The chapter's pretty clear. Playing it wrong also creates a picture, but it's a faulty one.
And fixing that is tough.
Incredibly difficult, and wearisome is the word used. Especially rhythm mistakes, apparently. Those are really hard to root out once they're in.
So avoiding mistakes from the get-go is crucial for fast progress.
Absolutely critical. And it gives tips. Play very slowly at first. Really concentrate, especially on rhythm. It even suggests counting out loud.
Okay.
And always use the right fingering. The claim is pretty bold. With absolute focus, you can nail small sections correctly in minutes, not days or weeks.
Minutes versus weeks. That really underlines the power of concentration. What about interpretation? Adding feeling.
Hold off on that initially, it advises. The pupil's usually too busy grappling with the technical stuff. If you try to interpret too early and get it wrong, that creates another false impression that's hard to fix later.
So technique first, then expression. Makes sense. And how should you practice the piece itself, the structure?
Small chunks. Study a little bit really thoroughly, master it, then add a bit more. Practice that with the same focus. It suggests maybe practicing 3 or 4 of these short mastered parts together.
So not necessarily whole phrases right away.
Right. It actually pushes back against the idea that you must practice only in complete phrases. Mastering the small bits perfectly, it says, makes the whole phrase better in the end.
Okay, but this absolute concentration, that sounds intense. How long can anyone realistically keep that up?
Yeah, the book is practical about this. It reckons true. Uninterrupted concentration only lasts about, say, 20 to 30 minutes.
That's it.
Apparently. Trying to push longer is useless, it says, or maybe even harmful.
Harmful? What?
Because your attention wanders. You might slip back into mindless repetition. Or worse, start making mistakes again and reinforcing those faulty brain pictures.
Ah, okay. So what's the suggested schedule then?
Short bursts. Practice with focus, then take a break, rest the brain, come back later, maybe in an hour or so. It gives the example of concert players often working effectively in focused half-hour sessions, maybe 5 or 6 times a day.
Yeah.
Way different from slogging through 5 or 7 hours straight without real focus, which it says is often ineffective and unhealthy.
Quality over quantity, basically, delivered in focused chunks.
Precisely. And it makes this interesting, almost sobering point, this kind of true mental study, this deep concentration. It's surprisingly rare.
Even in talented students.
Even in intelligent, talented ones, yes. Teachers might ask for it, but the chapter claims few pupils actually manage to use their brains correctly while they practice.
So it requires real discipline, maybe even being pushed a bit.
Yeah, it emphasizes the need for untiring patience from the teacher to almost force the student to concentrate.
Yeah.
And that concentration is the bedrock for really mastering the music, for playing from memory, all of it.
Special technical problems. So, getting into specifics now.
Exactly. We're talking etudes, scales, broken chords, playing chords, the trill.
Right, and also this idea of tranquility and movement, stuff beyond the absolute basics.
And the mission here really is to unpack how the author approaches these. It's often a bit different from the usual grinded-out mentality, isn't it?
Definitely seems that way.
Yeah.
Okay, so getting started. They make a really strong point that technique is deep down mental work.
Very much so. They talk about achieving marvelous results surprisingly quickly with intense focus.
Which really flies in the face of just logging hours and hours on exercises.
Absolutely. The book calls spending hours on, say, etudes without real concentration a very roundabout way. Could even be harmful. So the advice is study very few etudes, but get them absolutely perfect using that mindful, intense study we talked about before.
And practically speaking, spending all that time on exercises means less time for actual music, right? The Beethoven, the Mozart.
Exactly. Time you could be spending on repertoire with, real musical substance. Sight read etudes maybe, but deep study, be selective.
Okay, what about scales? Everyone does scales.
Necessary, yes, to a certain extent, they say. But here's the twist. The most important part isn't the fingers, it's the ear.
The ear for scales.
Uh-huh. And they point out a grave mistake,
Oh.
practicing hands together right away.
Oh, that feels like the standard way, though. Why not?
Well, think about it. Your fingers aren't equally strong. The thumb versus, say, the fourth finger. Big difference.
Right.
So when you play both hands together, it's almost impossible, they argue, to hear the dynamic value of each note clearly. You can't tell if it's truly even.
I see. The goal is evenness, and you need to isolate to actually hear if you're achieving it.
Precisely. So the method is hands separately, start super slow, maybe just 5 notes, and listen with intense focus. Is the sound even? Is the rhythm perfect? Are you staying relaxed?
Really zoning in on the sound.
Paying the most careful attention, as they put it. And there's a specific technique tip, too, for passing the thumb under or fingers over.
Yeah.
Use a rolling motion of the lower arm, like a gentle rotation. Not just shoving the hand sideways rigidly. It helps keep things loose.
Interesting. And they actually say C major is the hardest scale at first.
Yeah, because it's all white keys.
Oh.
That thumb under pass can feel a bit awkward initially compared to scales with the black keys helping guide the position.
Huh. But the payoff, they claim, is great technique pretty fast in a few weeks with this focused listening approach.
Quality and listening, definitely the theme. And it carries over to broken chords, arpeggios. Same idea. Use that lower arm roll.
Smoothness.
Yes, and don't forget the weak fourth finger. It needs specific attention. Sometimes practice little bits of arpeggios, just using that finger.
And they highlight dominant seventh and diminished seventh arpeggios.
Right, good for engaging all fingers and practicing relaxation over a wider stretch. Again, relaxation plus the ear equals that perfect evenness.
Okay, chords. Seems basic, but they find fault even with experienced players.
Well, beyond the obvious thing of hands not hitting together a grievous offense, apparently,
Okay.
the real skill is voicing within one hand, when there's a melody note inside the chord.
Making that top note sing out.
Exactly. That melody note needs to be louder, but the other notes in the chord still need to be there, perfectly balanced. Not too loud, not vanishingly quiet.
That takes incredible control.
Absolute control of the fingers, yes.
Yeah.
And how do you get it? By carefully training the ear. The sound tells you if you're doing it right.
Makes sense. What about things like trills, often seen as really tough?
Yeah, people think they take years, but the author argues concentration, ear, relaxation wonders can happen. Maybe even a good trill in weeks.
Weeks. Wow.
The secret is intense listening for the timing between the notes to be perfectly even and staying relaxed the whole time. Arm, hand, everything.
And learn them in actual pieces, not just exercises, like that Bach Sarabande example.
Right. More musical, more thorough, and keeping the fingers on the keys while trilling, crucial for control.
Okay, finally, this tranquility and movement idea.
Yeah, they're pretty direct. Fingers and hands stay as near to the keyboard as possible.
For certainty, quality of touch.
Exactly. And any big dramatic movements after you've played the note. Arm waving, body swaying.
Theatrical stuff.
Basically, yeah.
Sure.
The book says it has absolutely no influence on the sound already made. It might look impressive, but it can hinder certainty.
So keep it quiet, keep it controlled for the best execution.
That's the idea. True relaxation doesn't need big gestures. It's about perfect execution, guided by listening without unnecessary fluff.
Rhythmics, dynamics, pedal, and other problems of piano playing.
Yeah, covers a lot of ground. But where we're starting today is actually foundational before you even get to all those other problems.
Exactly. It's the very first section of that chapter. It's titled, Introduction and Reflection for the Mental Conception of the Allemande from the French suite in E major by Bach.
Right. So the mission here really is to unpack Leimer's very, very detailed method for thinking through a piece, mentally mastering it. And he uses this Bach Allemande as, like, the case study.
Yeah, it's all about mapping it out in your head, you know. He argues pretty strongly that truly top-tier playing doesn't just happen with fast fingers.
No, it comes after you've really grappled with the core musical issues, the notes, the timing, how touch even works, all that stuff.
He calls it successive solving and says it needs intense focus.
And he has some pretty direct words for students he sees as mentally lazy.
He really does. He believes the absolute key to building a solid musical memory and getting over technical blocks is this super meticulous analysis.
Of tiny pieces, right? Like single measures or just short phrases.
Exactly. Analyzing and memorizing those tiny bits. It's mind training, pure and simple, done by really reflecting deeply on the score itself.
And he lays out exactly how to do this reflection using that Bach piece. He says, glancing at the notes on the page helps a bit. But the real power comes from this detailed, almost, you could say, painstaking thinking about its structure.
Yeah, and he even anticipates pushback, like acknowledging it might sound way too complicated or wordy.
But he totally insists this mental work, this deep dive, is actually the fastest way to get what the composer intended.
His advice is super practical, too. Don't move past a measure or even a little phrase until it's completely memorized, locked in.
And get this, he suggests reflecting on these small chunks 4 to 6 times a day.
Wow.
Yeah. Not necessarily playing it over and over on the piano yet, but that focused mental engagement with the notes, the patterns, the structure.
And the payoff, according to Leimer, was pretty incredible. He saw his students using this method master and memorize big sections of this Allemande.
With total certainty.
Yeah, absolute certainty, he says, and way faster than you'd expect in comparatively few days.
Apparently, he could just point to random spots they'd mentally marked.
These marked places.
Yeah. And boom, they could recall it and play it instantly.
Which brings us to these mental anchors he talks about. It's not just vague thinking. He gives concrete ways to label sections to help memory.
Exactly, like measure 2. What does he call that one?
He calls it the tritone measure.
Right, the tritone, a very distinct sound in music. So he uses that label to kind of pin down the memory of that specific measure's feel, its harmony. He even points out the notes, like left hand descending there.
Then you get to measure 3, which he labels the 6th cadence.
Okay, so a cadence is like a musical punctuation mark, a point of rest. And here, the anchor is the pattern of descending sixths. He notes how some are obvious, some are kind of hidden within other notes. It's about finding these key structural signposts, isn't it?
Totally. Then measures 5 and 6 together form the chord spot.
Chord spot. So that tells you immediately these measures are built around chords, probably mainly in the left hand.
Exactly. Left-hand chords with the right hand doing melodic stuff around them. He even highlights the specific starting notes of the chords as anchors.
And it just keeps going like that. Measures 7 and 8.
The scale cadence makes sense, right? Because those measures have clear scales leading to a resting point. Simple label, easy recall.
And measure 9, the 6-5-4 position. That's a bit more technical, a harmony term.
Right. It identifies a specific chord structure for musicians, but it serves the same purpose. An instant mental trigger for what's happening harmonically there, especially contrasting with the left hand bringing back a bit of the opening idea.
What's really striking is Leimer's conviction. He insists that this level of deliberate analysis, breaking it down, finding patterns, naming these mental spots or cadences.
That's the secret sauce. That's what makes memory and technique grow extraordinarily and rapidly.
It's the intentional mental heavy lifting that unlocks the physical progress faster. It's not just mindless repetition.
Technique through mental work.
Yeah, and right off the bat, the chapter says there's a lot of confusion around this. What does mental work for technique even mean? People aren't really clear on it.
Because I think for most people, technique means fingers flying, right? Speed, accuracy, getting the notes out almost automatically.
That's the standard view,
Yeah.
just physical skill. But this chapter, it turns that on its head. It argues that actually perfect technique comes mainly from pretty intense brain work, calls it the fastest way.
Okay. Intense brain work. So the book contrasts two ways people practice. There's the way most students do it.
Which is basically playing tricky parts over and over, but without really concentrating hard,
Yeah.
sort of hoping it just embeds itself, gets into the fingers subconsciously. And the author is quite critical of that. Says it's unreliable, takes forever, and often leads to, memory slips, nerves, stage fright.
Definitely. It feels easier, maybe less demanding than focused thought, but the book argues it actually takes longer and, importantly, never quite gets you to perfection.
So what's the alternative? This minority approach the author champions.
It's all about the brain work leading the way. You start by forming a really precise mental image, like a perfect picture in your head, of the notes you need to play.
An internal score, almost.
Exactly that. And then from that mental blueprint, you apply intense, focused concentration on absolutely everything. The fingering, the specific touch, the exact note length, dynamics, all of it.
That does sound strenuous.
It is. That concentration is the strenuous part. It's active intellectual effort directed at the physical execution.
And there are examples, right? Bach's invention.
Yes, the first two-part invention. The instruction is to start super slow, like 70 mm for a quarter note, really crawling.
ISO slow.
Because at that speed, your brain has to be in control. It can't be automatic. And you practice it very softly, piano or pianissimo, focusing intensely on making every single tone dynamically equal. And the space, the interval between notes, perfectly timed.
So it's not just hitting the right keys.
Not at all. It's fundamentally training your ear. The book stresses this. It teaches you to hear with much greater detail, to really notice tiny differences in volume, and to feel the precise length and value of each note. Essential stuff, apparently, even if it's not commonly taught this way.
Okay, so you master it perfectly slowly, then what?
Then, and only then, when it's absolutely flawless at that slow tempo, you gradually, carefully speed it up.
And for a whole piece. You don't just start at the beginning and go through slowly.
No, the author warns against that, says it leads to being superficial. The method is to pick out very short bits, like really small fragments, the tricky parts.
Isolate the difficulties.
Precisely. Tackle those tiny chunks first. Start them very slow, apply that intense concentration, get them perfect, then gradually accelerate just that fragment. You only piece the perfected fragments together later on.
That makes sense. And there was something about exact note lengths, too, especially in lyrical music.
Yes, cantilena style. Holding notes for their full exact value. The author argues this adds warmth and depth. They point out how even top players sometimes rush, sort of crowd in the ends of phrases.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean.
And it's often blamed on, temperament or the piece's structure. But this book says no, it's usually a failure to have worked out those tiny motives with precise mental control beforehand. You lose that calm expression.
Interesting. And dynamics. How does that link to finger development? The book mentions fingers aren't naturally even, right?
Right. Thumb tends to be soft, second and third finger strong, fourth is weak, fifth needs deliberate energy. Achieving an even sound isn't about bashing exercises, according to this.
So how do you get evenness?
Again, it comes back to ear training and concentrated practice, specifically practicing very slow, very soft, very connected notes, legatissimo touch, maybe 6 to 8 times a day, guided, really feeling the exact force each finger needs.
That requires real patience.
And focus. You're constantly listening, adjusting, feeling the minimal energy needed, keeping everything else relaxed. The idea is this focused work builds control and ease much faster than mindless scales.
And what about those scales and studies? Hannon, Czerny.
Controversial take here. The author thinks they're mostly unnecessary, except maybe for absolute beginners. For everyone else, just take the technical challenges directly from the pieces you're actually learning.
Really? Just use the repertoire itself?
Yeah. The argument is that the intense concentration you apply while learning the piece makes that technical work so effective you don't need separate generic exercises. Rhythmics.
Rhythm, while totally fundamental, is often kind of underdeveloped,
Yeah.
even in players with a lot of experience.
Yeah, it sounds like one of those skills people assume they've mastered, but this source suggests maybe not. So our goal here is to unpack what this chapter says, why strict rhythm is supposedly so vital,
Uh-huh.
how the source thinks it should be taught and what it critiques, and this interesting link between, rigidity and freedom in music. All straight from the text.
Exactly. And the author doesn't waste any time. They state pretty clearly that strict rhythm is crucial because it defines the whole character, the feel of a piece.
Right.
And developing that internal sense, well, the text argues it starts early, assuming the student has the aptitude for it.
And here's something that jumped out at me from the source. It claims being able to really hear and reproduce tiny time differences is a huge sign of progress in ear training, maybe even more telling than years of study without that specific focus.
That brings up a key point in the chapter. If someone has a great ear for pitch, melody and harmony, but hasn't been trained to listen for these rhythmic details, what the author calls time discrimination,
Mm-hmm.
they might just never get it. The source presents this almost like an observed scientific fact.
Which leads to a really quite a strong statement in the text. The author claims that not one pianist who came to them for further study actually showed this precise time discrimination.
Right, and not just amateurs.
No, exactly, including concert pianists. And when these experienced players were asked to just count rhythmically, privately, the description is, well, irregular and utterly worthless.
Wow. Yeah, the source says it took endless pains just to instill basic counting in them. It really highlights what the author saw as a big gap in teaching back then.
So how does the source define rhythmics itself, and how should it be taught?
Well, the text defines it simply as the study of rhythm in language or music, and it points to its origins in dance. It ranks rhythm second only to melody in form and importance.
Okay.
And the core teaching, it really comes down to understanding the arithmetic of the notation, how measures divide time, the fractions of notes and rests. The author seems genuinely surprised that advanced players might not know basic rest symbols.
So that understanding, that metrical calculation, being able to add and subtract those note values is presented as totally fundamental.
Absolutely. The focus is on practicing dividing and adding up these values within measures until it becomes automatic. The text even suggests using tricky examples from actual pieces.
And it says for students who tend to play by ear, without that strict timing, the teacher's main job is teaching musical independency based on this metrical understanding.
Yeah, getting grounded in the score.
And the number one method the source pushes for developing this internal rhythm.
It's very short and loud counting while playing. Very specific about that.
Explicitly dismisses other things, right? Like clapping or tapping your foot. Says they aren't refined enough for the ear training needed.
Exactly. And they acknowledge that, okay, many modern teachers at the time were against counting. But the author counters by citing examples, like famous pianists admitting they still count sometimes, privately.
Kind of a validation for the method.
The text even lays out specific counting exercises, starting simple, like with a metronome, then moving to complex stuff like 2 against 3 beats, things that are common in music but often played badly because the foundation isn't there.
The ultimate goal being that this builds an independent rhythmic feeling inside, so you don't need to count out loud eventually. The metronome becomes just a temporary check.
Right, a guide, not a crutch. The source also mentions common errors, like stealing time from notes or rests, especially after playing faster notes.
And stresses that pauses, the silences, are just as important rhythmically as the notes you actually play.
Definitely. Now, after all that focus on strictness, the text does shift gears. It starts talking about musical liberties. Tempo is defined first just the speed, beats per minute, and the metronome, Melzel's invention, is the composer's tool for setting that strict tempo.
But then comes the crucial part. The source says to be a real artist, you have to take liberties. Often, even when the score doesn't explicitly tell you to. That's where individuality comes in. It mentions a Gieseking for those small, unmarked tempo adjustments.
Yeah, the subtle shifts. And then, of course, the marked changes. Rubato, speeding up, accelerando, slowing down, ritardando. The author notes some natural tendencies, like rushing during a crescendo, and common mistakes in making these changes smooth.
Which has practical implications, like playing with others. If a pianist's timing is off or their liberties are unmusical, it can mess up a whole orchestra.
Right, but when everyone feels the changes together, it works perfectly, that mutual feeling.
And finally, the fermata gets a mention, that hold symbol. It lengthens a note or rest, but how long is up to the performer, often used at phrase endings.
Or before cadenzas. And cadenzas themselves, often unmeasured ornamental passages giving the performer lots of freedom, especially the small cadenza, played freely but ideally still connected to the main pulse. Simply dynamics.
Dynamics sounds important. What's the book's take on what that actually means?
Well, it traces it back to the Greek word dynamis, which means power,
Power. Okay.
and defines it as the science of power
Yeah.
applied to tones in different degrees.
The science of power. I like that. So our goal today, I think, is to really unpack that
Right. Why dynamics are so critical for, musical feeling.
and how they're marked, how pianists execute them, and this idea of individual interpretation the book brings up.
Exactly. It's about the lifeblood of the music, really, giving it shape.
That ebb and flow you hear.
Precisely. The contrast between strong tones, weak tones, the gradual build-up or fade away. That's what gives music expression plasticity.
Plasticity, interesting word. Without dynamics, it would just be monotonous.
Completely flat, yeah. The book actually points out how this emphasis grew over time.
Yep.
It compares like the gentle rustling effects in Haydn to the huge sonic storms in Wagner or Berlioz, a
yeah.
big shift.
And the piano itself changed to accommodate that, didn't it?
Definitely. From the clavichords, sort of delicate focus, to the modern concert grand. Huge power potential.
Which allowed for those, thunderous moments people associate with Liszt.
It became part of the language. But the book stresses it's not just about being loud.
Right, the other end of the spectrum.
Exactly. Great players also chase that pianissimo. So soft it's barely there. Always seeking contrast.
So how do composers actually write this down?
They use signs, mostly Italian terms, but probably all recognize. P for piano, soft.
On F for forte, loud.
Right. And then it expands, P, 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 P for even softer, F, F for louder still, sometimes even more.
And for the changes, the swells and fades.
That's crescendo, often just cresque, for getting louder.
And decrescendo or diminuendo dim for getting softer.
Plus accents, like sforzato, S for sudden emphasis, or marcato for just, marked playing.
And little words can tweak these, right? Like molto for much.
Or poco a poco, little by little, gives incredible control over nuance.
Okay, but here's something the book really emphasizes, and it feels important. These markings, FP, FF, they're relative.
Yes, this is absolutely key. It's not like tempo, where you have a metronome clicking away seconds.
A universal standard.
There's no machine for loudness. The book says it point blank. It's left entirely to the player's discretion.
So an F for one player might sound different from another player's F.
Totally different. It mentions Rubinstein's Mighty Thunder, something maybe a less experienced player just physically couldn't produce, even if they tried.
Wow, so that relativity, what does that mean for us listening or for someone playing?
It means interpretation is everything. The same piece, the same markings can feel vastly different.
Because the artist builds their performance on their idea of what F or P means.
Exactly. And even for the same pianist, the book notes their piano today might be slightly different tomorrow, depending on their, disposition.
The book actually calls this lack of a fixed standard an advantage.
It does. It recognizes the player's ingenuity, their creative input.
It also talks about the difference between loud and soft needing to be clear, especially sudden changes, like in Beethoven.
Yeah, it uses an analogy like clearly pronouncing consonants in speech. These dynamic shifts need to be worked out, distinct.
Otherwise, it just becomes
blurry blotches.
And getting a true pianissimo, that really quiet sound, is often harder.
Much harder, generally. Mistakes glare out in quiet passages. When you're playing loud, things can get masked more easily.
Makes sense. What about accents, like that sforzando?
Taste is crucial there. An SF in a gentle piece shouldn't sound the same as one in a really forceful piece. context matters.
And simpler accents, like the little wedge or arrow marks.
Those are described as softer, less explosive than SF, more of a stress than a shock.
Now, those gradual changes, crescendo and decrescendo, they need practice too, I imagine.
Oh, definitely. The book mentions a critique by von Bülow.
Hmm.
He complained about players having an intolerable routine, like they'd start a crescendo too loud immediately, or get soft way too early in a diminuendo.
So not gradual at all.
Right. The proper way, according to the text, is to start based on the previous dynamic level
Okay.
and then gradually increase or decrease towards the target. Like those hairpin symbols visually show. Start small, get bigger, or vice versa.
And physically achieving this involves different kinds of touch.
Yes, a whole range, from
Yeah.
gentle finger placement for PP.
To using more hand or arm swing for louder sounds.
Exactly, even the whole arm for a big fortissimo. There's a spectrum of physical action matching the dynamic spectrum.
The text also brings up melody versus accompaniment.
Usually the melody needs to stand out, yeah. So one hand might naturally play louder. Gets complex in polyphony, though, or when one hand does both jobs.
And playing chords consistently requires technique, too.
Consistent fingertip level, firm pressure, helps get even tone and control over the overall dynamic.
So it's really clear this dynamic shading isn't simple. It's described as a profound art.
Requires dedicated practice, diligence, and crucially, a really refined ear. Constant listening.
The book even urges teachers to push for it early on, even in basic pieces.
Absolutely. Get students thinking about characteristic shading from the start.
Okay, so to wrap up, dynamics isn't just loud soft. It's this complex.
Science of power, yeah. Applied nuance that gives music its feeling, its flexibility.
And the really fascinating takeaway from this source is how much is intentionally left open. The markings are relative.
It hinges on the artist's interpretation, their disposition in the moment. It's fundamental to their delivery.
So here's something to think about. Since so much emotional color comes down to the artist's dynamic choices, maybe next time you hear the same piece by two different pianists.
Listen specifically for those differences.
Yeah, listen for how their unique use of dynamics, their louds, their softs, their crescendos might be telling a completely different story, painting a different emotional landscape. It really lets you hear the individual interpreter's voice.
Chapter 5.
Yes, variety of touch.
So the plan is to unpack what the source says about all the different ways pianists, well, touch the keys, going beyond just hitting them.
Right. It's about control, sound, dynamics, even avoiding getting tired while playing. Understanding these different touches is key.
The book calls this chapter a vital synopsis, and it mentions Eugene Tetzel quite a bit, his role.
Tetzel, yeah. He apparently tried to blend the old and new schools of thought, kind of find a middle ground that worked.
And he came up with 4 main categories.
That's what the source lays out. 4 basic touch possibilities. The free fall, the throw stroke swing, the roll, and the pressure.
Okay. And there's a big difference between the last one and the others. Something about the fingers.
Exactly. For the first 3 fall, roll the fingers usually start above the keys, kind of suspended. But with pressure, the finger is already resting on the key surface before you actually play the note. Big difference in initiation.
Got it. Okay, let's break them down. The free fall first.
Think. Gravity, like you're just letting a part of your arm drop onto the key.
Drop. From where?
Could be the whole shoulder and arm, could be just the lower arm, the wrist, or even just the finger itself initiating the fall.
That changes the sound.
Completely. The source says the strength, the volume, depends directly on which body part you use. Whole arm for loud, finger for soft.
Makes sense.
But the key thing is it needs relaxation with some necessary fixing of joints. Not stiff, but controlled. And you can't really do it well if you're already tired.
Okay. What about the throw, stroke, and swing? Sounds more active.
It is more muscular. You use fixed fingers, but the power comes from the hand and arm muscles actively throwing or stroking the key.
And the benefit?
Well, the book highlights that you can get a huge dynamic range with this, from really loud F down to soft PP. And interestingly, it says this can help prevent fatigue.
Prevent fatigue.
Yeah, compared to just relying on finger power alone. The swing is mentioned as sort of an elastic, rebound-like motion connected to this.
Interesting. Okay, next up, the roll.
This one originates more from the shoulder or the radius joint that's in your forearm. The idea is you rotate.
Like a tremolo.
Exactly. The tremolo is the classic example given, a really fast, nonstop roll. Other joints need to be kind of fixed to allow that rotation.
And the elbow. I remember reading something.
Ah, yes. The source points out that when you do this rolling motion well, the elbow often naturally lifts a bit. It says this is fine, even helpful.
Unlike older methods.
Right. Some older teaching apparently insisted on clamping the elbow down. This source says let it move naturally. But it does make a point that trills are different, mostly fingerwork, though a roll might support sometimes.
Good distinction. All right, last one. The pressure touch. Finger starts on the key.
Correct. Finger is resting there. Then you press down using the weight of the arm through that fixed finger.
And this is good for tone shading.
The fingertips become really important here for subtle control. Especially for soft playing, it can get you the absolute softest pianissimo.
Useful.
And it's recommended for chords, especially if you want them perfectly even. Helps amateurs avoid one note sticking out.
Ah, okay. And that bit about a flatter finger.
Yeah. The source suggests for a singing tone, you might flatten the finger slightly using more of the pad. The idea is it engages more nerves, gives you a richer feel, more color, like you're feeling the tone more.
So 4 types. But in reality, you're mixing these up all the time, right?
Absolutely. The source is clear. Real playing involves constant combinations and transitions between these touches, and fundamentally, it really stresses active finger development. Strong, independent fingers are the base. It disagrees with older ideas that just focused on holding the hand still.
Which leads to that infamous weak 4th finger.
The sorrow child, yeah. The book basically says you just have to work it diligently. Trills, chords, everything. Specifically using that finger to build its strength. No shortcuts.
Okay, so how do these touches help with specific things, like scales or octaves?
Well, scales and arpeggios are mainly finger action, but supported by smooth, small arm movements. But for things like octaves, sixth, thirds, the source says forget the old wrist-only rule.
Use more.
Use everything. Finger, wrist, elbow, shoulder. Engage the bigger muscles.
That makes sense for power and avoiding fatigue. Especially in those really demanding pieces.
Exactly. Think Liszt Rhapsody, Chopin's Sixth Etude.
Yeah.
Really fast octaves, or sixths, are exhausting. You need relaxation strategies and the bigger muscles. Getting legato in those intervals is also tricky. Sometimes needs a bit of a finger glide.
And chords?
Can be played various ways, throw, stroke, even from the elbow. But that pressure touch we talked about, excellent for controlled, even accompaniment chords, lets you manage the dynamics precisely.
And quickly, what about polyphony, multiple voices, and phrasing?
Touch is crucial there. You use different touches or different intensities of the same touch to make each melodic line clear. For phrasing, it's how you shape everything, the start of a phrase, building to a climax, how you end it, the little lifts or pauses. It's all done through careful control of touch.
So really, understanding this variety of touch is fundamental. It's not just about hitting notes. It's about how giving you control, dynamics, efficiency.
And musicality. It's your palette, the way you paint the sound and tell the story.
Which really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How does consciously picking one touch over another actually change the musical message you're sending out? Not just the sound, but the meaning behind it. We're tackling Chapter 6, which is all about phrasing. How does this chapter actually define phrasing? What are we talking about, essentially?
Well, at its core, it's about figuring out the limits of the musical ideas, the phrases.
Setting the boundaries.
Yeah, and bringing out their nuances. The book sees it as absolutely fundamental to the music. Notation-wise, the basics are things like slurs, those fermatas for pauses, and commas sometimes to mark divisions.
And dynamics play a role right from the start.
Definitely. Dynamic shading is often mentioned for emphasizing the start and end points.
Okay, so there are signs, but the text points out a pretty big snag almost immediately, doesn't it? These phrasing bows, they look just like legato slurs.
Oh, absolutely. That's a major point of confusion the text really highlights. Composers use these bows all the time, and yes, visually, they're identical to legato marks.
That must cause headaches.
It really does. The chapter mentions, historical attempts to sort it out, like suggesting legato should just be the default assumed touch.
And bows would only mean phrasing.
Right. But honestly, the chapter basically says composers and theorists just kept adding more signs for tricky situations. And the result was this overabundance that just made things even more confusing for players trying to figure out what was what.
Wow. More signs leading to more confusion. And the list it gives is quite something like cross slurs for notes shared between phrases.
Exactly. Or joined bows, maybe a tenuto mark, if a note needs holding across the phrase break. Plus, you get interrupted bows if an entrance is cut short, little strokes for dividing things up, even punctuation marks sometimes for indicating heavy or light bars.
So the source really flags the, quote, shortcomings and overabundance as the main problem areas with notation here.
Precisely. It makes interpretation challenging from the get-go.
So if the written signs themselves are often, well, ambiguous, how does the chapter suggest you figure out the phrasing when you're actually interpreting a piece?
Okay, this is where understanding the music's form becomes really critical. You need to have a handle on concepts like time motives, time groups, these semi-movements.
How they build up.
Yeah, how they build into larger periods, like those antecedent and consequent phrases everyone learns about. Often that underlying structure tells you more than the notation itself.
And if you're still unsure where a phrase actually ends, what clues does the book suggest looking for?
It gives some pretty concrete things to check. Harmony is a big one, looking for different kinds of cadences. Full, half, deceptive, or those so-called feminine closes, where the melody ends on a weak beat.
Okay, cadences? What else?
Well, obvious pauses and rests are good indicators too, provided they're not just like shortening a note value for effect.
Or you can look at how the next phrase starts. Does that help define the end of the current one?
Yes, exactly. How the following musical thought begins can tell you a lot. If it starts with an upbeat, the break often happens right before that upbeat comes around again.
Ah, I see.
Or if it starts really firmly on a heavy beat, it's probably setting up a contrast with the end of the phrase before it. It leads to this principle the text mentions. Similarly separates, dissimilarity binds. Kind of a neat way to put it.
That is interesting. Structure defining the separation.
Yeah.
But structures aren't always neat and tidy, are they? What about when things get disturbed?
Oh, they get disturbed all the time, often through insertions or extensions, think sequences or repeating parts, maybe altering them slightly. The chapter uses Beethoven as a prime example here, pointing to bits in his Opus 57 Presto, Opus 27, Opus 26, Opus 22. He was a master manipulator of structure.
So you can add bits in? Can you take bits out too?
Yes, omissions are another way structures get disturbed. Sometimes parts are left out, which can actually unify phrases that might otherwise feel separate. Again, there's a Beethoven example, Opus 10, number 2.
And other markers. Anything else that signals a break.
Yeah, the text also mentions things like big leaps or skips in the melody, a sudden change of direction, or even just repeating the same note can sometimes mark a separation.
Okay, so analysis helps you find the phrase boundaries. How do you then actually perform them so the listener hears it? What about dynamics and timing?
Absolutely essential. Dynamic shading and these slight unwritten changes in time, what they call agogics, are really key to making the phrase shape clear.
Okay.
The general rule presented is one main dynamic climax per phrase, and it usually lands on a rhythmically strong or heavy note. You typically build towards it with a crescendo.
And then maybe fall away.
Often followed by a diminuendo, yes. Or sometimes just a swell on the main note itself.
And the agogics. How does the timing interact with those dynamics?
Well, the agogic pattern, often described as a slight acceleration leading up to that dynamic high point.
Speeding up towards it.
Right. And you might give that climax note itself just a tiny bit of extra length, a slight prolongation. Then frequently you'd pull back the tempo a bit, a retardation, towards the very end of the phrase.
Makes sense. What about actually separating one phrase from the next, especially if there isn't a convenient rest written in?
Yeah, a rest makes it obvious, doesn't it? But when phrases follow without interruption, it's more subtle. You need a clear break, but you don't want it to sound choppy or completely detached.
How do you manage that?
Dynamically, the typical approach is that the very last note of the phrase you're finishing is unstressed, kind of tails off slightly. And then the first note of the new phrase gets the emphasis, it predominates. Or the text mentions a Beethoven trick. Sometimes starting the new phrase forte and then immediately dropping to pianissimo creates a clear separation.
Interesting. Any other ways?
You could also achieve it by holding that final note just a fraction longer than written, or by giving a more distinct dynamic attack to the first note of the incoming phrase. The main caution, though, is not to sound completely disconnected, not to break the overall flow.
Right, keep the line going.
Exactly. And the chapter briefly mentions other theorists, like Riemann, who proposed even more signs like little strokes at phrase endings. Again, just highlighting how varied and sometimes confusing the notation side can be.
It sounds incredibly involved. Pulling all this together, the notation, the analysis, the dynamic, the timing, the chapter does say this isn't easy for students, right?
Oh, absolutely. The text is quite clear that really grasping phrasing is complex and, yeah, often confusing for learners. It definitely emphasizes needing guidance from a good teacher.
Makes sense.
And there's that important warning, quoting Sharenka, about the risk. The risk that getting too caught up in all the tiny details, the dissections, could make you, the student, lose sight of the bigger picture, the main climax of the whole piece.
Yeah, losing the forest for the trees, a real challenge for you, the listener, if you're working on this yourself.
Definitely.
The pedal.
Right. And you might think, oh, the pedal, that's just, loud and soft.
Yeah, but this chapter shows it's way more complex than that. It's often misunderstood, apparently.
And absolutely crucial for, well, really expressive playing.
Totally. The author dives right in with a pretty common problem. Even advanced players sometimes struggle with basic pedaling.
Like what specifically?
Well, distinguishing between two key types, time treading and syncopated pedaling.
Okay.
And the really interesting argument here is that it's not just like a foot coordination thing. Often it comes down to the ear.
Insufficient ear training, it says, so it's about hearing it correctly.
Exactly. Your ear guides your foot, essentially.
Okay, so let's break those down. What is time treading?
That's the more direct one. You press the pedal down precisely with the beat, right when your fingers play.
Especially on strong beats, it mentions.
Right. The book actually suggests, maybe players should use this one more often than they tend to.
Okay. And the other one, syncopated pedaling, sometimes called post-treading.
Exactly. Syncopated. That's where you hold the pedal from the last chord or note.
Uh-huh.
Then you lift it and immediately press it down again, but just after you play the new note or chord.
Wait, after? Wouldn't that create a gap? Or maybe worse, a blur?
It sounds like it would, yeah. A muddy mess, you might think.
Right.
But the mechanism is fast. The damper for the old note drops so quickly in that tiny moment that your ear mainly just perceives a smooth connection to the new sound. It kind of blends it seamlessly.
Okay, I see. So that syncopated technique is key for legato.
Absolutely. For connecting things, your fingers just can't bridge like big jumps or harmonically different chords that need to flow.
Got it. Time treading on the beat, syncopated just after for smoothness. And the book is clear. This needs dedicated foot practice.
Just like scales for your fingers, yeah.
Yeah.
They have to become automatic.
There's even advice on how to sit, isn't there? Heels down, ball of the foot.
Yep. Ensuring control and, importantly, quiet operation. No clunky pedal noises.
Definitely don't want those.
And another interesting technique mentioned, using the pedal before you even play the note.
Before? How does that work?
For things like short, accented notes, appoggiaturas, or leading into a phrase. Lifting the dampers first lets the other strings vibrate sympathetically before the hammer hits.
Oh, so it gives the note a richer start, kind of pre-resonates it.
Exactly. A neat little coloristic effect.
Cool. The chapter also differentiates the main pedals, obviously. Right pedal damper or loud pedal.
I love the dampers, yeah. And the left, the una corda or soft pedal.
It references some older texts, too, like Kohler.
It makes a really important point about rules for pedaling.
That they're hard to fix.
Very. Because there are so many exceptions. Different pianists pedal the same piece differently. And, both ways might sound great.
So it really comes down to taste and context.
And careful listening. The absolute key is never using it carelessly, never just as a, what's the phrase?
A footrest. Only lifting it when the sound becomes an ugly conglomeration. Love that term.
Huh, yeah. Ugly conglomeration. It paints a picture, doesn't it?
It really does. So the chapter lists 3 main reasons to use the pedal. What are they again?
Okay. First, increasing tone volume or richness. Second, creating legato that fingers can't. And third, achieving specific aesthetic effects, like tone painting.
And those aesthetic effects often rely on the first 2, right?
Pretty much. The damper pedal lifts all dampers, letting strings vibrate sympathetically. That's where the richness comes from, especially in the bass.
Blending tones together.
Right. But if you don't manage it, if you don't change it at the right time,
then you get the ugly conglomerations. The book gives good examples, like for volume and blending within one harmony, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata first movement.
Classic example. You can hold the pedal for a while there, but you still need your ear to judge when it gets too thick.
Or creating that sort of resonant noise effect in big pieces like Chopin polonaises.
Yes, that filling up sound. But even when harmonies aren't changing fast, you have to be careful not to blur the actual melody.
Meter, rhythm, phrasing, those often dictate the pedal changes.
Exactly. Which leads to another really interesting point the chapter makes.
About old music on new pianos.
Yeah. Like, even if Mozart didn't write pedal marks because his piano was different,
we should still use the modern pedal.
the argument is yes, absolutely. To get a singing tone, to use the resonance of our pianos today, it's aesthetically justified.
It says it would be foolish not to leverage the modern instrument's capabilities.
Right, like insisting on playing Bach only on a harpsichord. The modern piano has its own character.
Makes sense. What about scales, though?
The advice is generally don't pedal them unless there's a clear underlying harmony that can kind of absorb the clashes. Or maybe if it's very high and light or super fast and fluid, like some Chopin passages.
Okay. And then there's the legato use, again, connecting things fingers can't reach. Broken chords, wide intervals.
Schumann's symphonic etudes get mentioned. Syncopated pedaling is the key there.
That seamless bridge, even sparingly in Bach fugues sometimes.
Yeah, very carefully, just to make a necessary connection without losing the clarity of the lines. Tricky balance.
And essential in transcriptions, right? Like Liszt's orchestral arrangement?
Definitely. Often the only way to sustain a melody note while the other parts are doing complex figurations, you just accept the brief clashes for the bigger picture.
Beyond just connecting, though, it creates actual textures. It talks about tone vapor.
Yeah, that wonderful, slightly blurred resonance you get when all the dampers are up. That is the characteristic sound of the modern piano, isn't it? Compared to dry, unpedaled notes.
Yeah, that's the sound we love, and that leads to the tone painting effects.
Right, like Liszt's crashing waves and St. Francis walking on the waves, sustained pedaled runs.
Or the Bird calls in his bird sermon, using pedal to blend tremolos.
Or even Schumann's Papillon's finale, holding the pedal through changing harmonies to create that specific dreamlike fading away effect. It's not about harmonic purity there.
It's about the overall sonic picture. And finally, it mentions using pedal for rhythm.
Yeah, reinforcing syncopation, pressing the pedal right on the strong beat, even if the note itself is off the beat. Some Beethoven examples show this.
So it shapes the rhythmic feel, too. Wow. It even mentions pedaling trills.
Advocates for it, mostly, despite the clash, views the trill as sort of one blended sound entity.
Okay, so summing this up, this dive into the pedal really shows it's definitely not just an add-on.
Not a footrest at all. It's fundamental to modern technique. It needs just as much practice and, crucially, listening as the fingers do.
We've covered time treading, syncopated pedaling, seeing how it creates legato, richness, that tone vapor.
And those dramatic tone paintings in Liszt or rhythmic drive in Beethoven, and why it makes sense on our pianos even for older music.
It really brings up a big question, doesn't it? If great pedaling depends so much on your ear, on artistic judgment.
And even deliberately using dissonance sometimes for a larger effect.
Yeah, then how much of truly beautiful playing actually goes way beyond just hitting the right notes and following the instructions on the page?
That's the fascinating part, isn't it? Where technique meets artistry through listening.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope this episode has given you meaningful insights and sparked your interest in the book we explored today. Just a reminder, this is only a brief summary and not a substitute for the full reading experience. We encourage you to read the original book to truly appreciate its depth. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss future episodes. And if you'd like to support our channel, feel free to share this video with friends. Every share helps our community grow.